Hey everybody, guess what we're studying now? Whoa, oh my God, oh my gosh, oh, whoa, oh, look at that, hey, everything's happening, oh, wait, no, wait. Remember, I was just shaking my computer. I guess I should just kind of relax a little bit, maybe a little too much coffee this morning. I'll set it down here. For a second, I thought house was shaking and everything was like, because has that ever happened? Like where your whole house starts shaking back and forth and everything starts falling over? And I bet none or very few of you have ever experienced that. But if you have, you've experienced an earthquake. Um, Anytime you have vibrating, shaking, rapid motion of the Earth's crust, that's an earthquake. All right? It doesn't happen around here too often. And if you think back to our study of plate tectonics, that makes a lot of sense. We're not near a plate boundary. What we get here are called isostatic rebound earthquakes. There used to be a glacier on top of us, a mile thick of ice, and it pressed us down. We're still rebounding, coming up from that ice melting. It only melted 10,000 years ago, kind of short geologically, so we're still coming up. So once in a while the ground which is all coming up, some of it comes up a little faster, shifts a little bit, and it makes a little bit of an earthquake. But those are mild earthquakes compared to the real rocking, rolling earthquakes that are somewhere between fascinating and terrifying, but they make the planet that you see before you. Most of the earthquakes occur at zones of weakness or a break in the bedrock known as a fault. At any place two massive pieces of rock start sliding past each other. The rocks are under forces, and eventually they're going to find some place, some zone of weakness where they will break. That's a fault, and the rocks then can move past each other. I was watching TV on October 17th, 1989, watching the World Series from California, and all of a sudden the picture started shaking. They weren't shaking their camera, the actual stadium, the whole state, or right around there, was shaking. They were in the middle of an earthquake. We were worried that it was what they call the big one, which they assume someday California is going to have a devastating earthquake, and likely will, and likely probably sooner rather than later. Nobody knows when, nobody knows exactly where. This was not the big one. This was one of many smaller earthquakes. Pretty big, certainly, for that area, but the big one is expected to be far more damaging. And it's something really to be concerned with. If you're ever in an area where earthquakes can occur, there's some things you need to really learn and make sure you're aware of. So you look at this picture, what's going on? Those are sedimentary rock layers. All right, you see some folding there, but then you see these lines where the sedimentary beds are clearly offset from each other. Those would have occurred during earthquakes, with the crust moving past each other. So the idea of an earthquake, when stress is built up in a rock greater than what the rock can resist, the crust shifts and suddenly releases the energy, and it radiates in all directions as vibrations. And if you use your arms, you can see it. This is one plate, this is another plate, and they're moving past each other. And as long as they keep moving past each other in series of gentle earthquakes, everything's fine. But when they get stuck, as of course they're irregular plate edges, so they're likely to get stuck occasionally. When they get stuck, the stress builds up. One of the plates actually upwarps and stores all this stress in it. And finally, it is more stress than the edge can support. And all of a sudden it breaks and everything moves all at once. That's the big earthquake that is scary. So where it actually occurs is called the focus, the place right above the focus on the surface where the earthquake waves hit so badly. That's the epicenter. And you see here, the epicenter certainly would look like the area that got hit the worst and is probably the worst earthquake damage. Certainly as you get farther from the earthquake, the damage is substantially less. That's the idea of the elastic rebound theory, that in the relaxed state, it's just sitting. In the stress state, it gets pushed and pushed and pushed, but it's storing all that energy in it. And then all of a sudden, bam, all at once, it breaks and everything moves. That sudden break, that's what we're scared with. So after the break occurs, the waves move away from the epicenter. Whenever the waves reach you, you shake. Of course, when you're really far from the earthquake, if an earthquake happens in California, are we likely to experience any aspect of it that we could feel ourselves here in New York? Almost certainly not. But our seismographs would pick it up. So the waves do come by, but really tiny earthquake waves you can't feel. So those waves are known as seismic waves. And seismic waves travel faster deep within the earth, but they travel at different speeds in different conditions. It's very similar to if you were to hurt your knee, they will use waves, their understanding of waves. Different waves will move through your knee at different speeds, or will be affected by your knee in different ways. And they'll show up in the x-ray or whatever they're using slightly differently. These waves give us information. So because we have earthquakes all over the planet, we can use the information from the waves as they come through the planet to tell us all about the planet. Whenever these waves change speed, they also refract, very much the way light refracts when it goes through your glasses. So there's two kinds of seismic waves. If we're holding a spring, you're on one end, I'm on the other end, and I hope you get to see this. I can send primary waves and I can send secondary waves to you. If I compress the spring and then let it go, so it's just those are primary waves. The disturbance is traveling in the same direction as the wave. If I lift up part of the spring and snap it like that, then the spring is this wave going through like that. Now the disturbance is at right angles to the way the wave is moving. Okay, those would be called secondary waves. Now I want you to think about something. You're watching a sports game and everybody does the wave. You've seen the wave go through the stadium like that. Stadium waves, are they S or P waves? Are you thinking about this? I hope so. All right. Well, what are the people doing? You see the wave coming, right? The wave's coming to you this way through the stadium. What are you getting ready to do? As soon as the wave gets to you, you stand up. Well, that's up and down as the wave is going that way. And the person next to you stands up after you, and the person next to them stands up after them, and the wave progresses that way. The particles, that's us in the stadium wave, move up and down. The wave moves around the stadium. So they would definitely be S waves. Stadium waves are S waves. I don't know if that helps you remember it, but. So the characteristics wave having different conditions allow geologists to infer properties of the Earth's interior. When you look at your Earth science reference tables, that's how we know what we know about the Earth's interior. An example of what happens with these waves as they go through. You'll notice if we point to this wave here, you notice that wave stops. All right, well, what kind of wave is that? Okay, that's yellow. So that's an S wave. That's an up and down wave. Why does an S wave just stop when it gets to the outer core? What would make an S wave stop? Well, S waves are up and down waves. Imagine you're in a wave pool. Now, a wave pool works because one whole wall has hydraulic jacks on it that can move very quickly and push the wall out and pull the wall back. That makes a wave that goes through the pool. Well, that's a push-pull, like a P wave, a push-pull. So a push-pull, that kind of wave, will go through liquid. Imagine now the side of the pool just goes up and down. Will that make a wave in the water? That's an S wave. Would that make a wave in liquid? No. If it's attached to solid going up and down, that'll make a wave through the solid. But through a liquid, the liquid will laugh at you as you go up and down. It's not going to do anything, right? So that S wave you see there, right, in green now, that S wave stops at the outer core because the outer core is, work with me on this one, what's the outer core? The outer core has to be liquid because the S wave doesn't even go into it. The S wave just stops. It's a killer of S waves. Meanwhile, look at our good friend, the P wave. The P wave going through it right there. Sure, the P wave will go through it. It'll bend as it goes through it because it'll change speed. But can P waves go through liquid? Well, can a wave generator push and pull a wall and make a wave go through liquid? It sure can. So P waves happily go through liquid. You heard it here. Now this is what P waves look like when they go through the planet. And this is freaky. Do you see where they show you the P wave shadow zone? So think about this for a second. If you have two waves, if you have a wave here and another wave right next to it there, and they go right next to each other, but one goes into the outer core, which it can because it's a P wave going back and forth, and the other just grazes the surface of the outer core. Well, the one that goes into the outer core bends, refracts a lot. The one that's right next to it doesn't. So you have this huge shadow zone. They call it the P wave shadow zone. And if you have a globe, it's a whole donut shape on the other side. This is a cross. I mean, this is just a cutout of a globe. But on a real globe, there would be a donut shape on the other side. So you have a huge earthquake on the other side of the planet. There are seismometers that will never, ever hear about it. That's kind of weird, isn't it? That's the P wave shadow zone. Huh? Anybody want to see what an S wave shadow zone would look like? Well, tell me, what do you think? Are S waves, when they go into the core, when an S wave goes into the core, is it going to refract? Is anybody saying, yo, hey, Mr. Yo, an S wave isn't going into the core. It's an S wave. Core is liquid. Done. Hey. So what does the S wave shadow zone look like? Bam. There is the S wave shadow zone. Not a donut. A whole chunk out of the earth where you don't get any information from an earthquake on the other side of the planet. Look at that. Huge amount of space where the S waves just don't go through. Why not? Outer core is liquid. If they have to go through the outer core to get to you, you're not going to hear about it. Not S waves. P waves, yes. Now, how do we know that the inner core, you have the outer core and then the inner core. How do we know the inner core is solid? How do we get any information about the inner core? Well, can you see? Look at all the P waves coming out here. The inner core, some of them are going to go through the inner core, and some of them are going to go through the outer core. The difference in how those waves show up when we analyze very carefully, you can imagine this is a challenging science, but when we analyze them very carefully, we learn what the inner core is like. And if you want your mind blown, if you simply get an idea of what's below your feet, it is incredible. And we know this. The inner core is about the size of the moon, and it's floating weightless in a sea. It's made itself of a crystal of iron and nickel, and it's floating in a sea of liquid iron and nickel. That's pretty crazy. So how do we measure earthquakes? Well, two different ways. The magnitude scales, we use seismometers, we just tell it like it is. But we can also use intensity scales based on reports of damage. When would you use that? How about when you have no seismometers, or when you're talking about deep history when they have no seismometers, and you're wondering how bad an earthquake really was through descriptions of some historian. That intensity scale would make a lot of sense. Seismometer is a pretty funny instrument. It's designed to measure seismic waves in the earth. So how do you do that? Well, you attach a pen to a heavy mass on a spring. So from the spring, from the ceiling, you have a heavy mass and a pen. That's designed to isolate it from earthquakes. Below it, you have a piece of paper on a table, basically. It's really on a rotating drum. There's a motor on it. That's the only thing the motor is doing, is turning the drum. right? The paper and the pen are just resting next to each other. Now, if the earth shakes, it's going to shake the paper. The pen attached to the big heavy weight on the spring is isolated from that movement, so the earth will shake underneath it and will trace out whatever the earth is doing. And that tracing is called a seismograph. So if we look at these simple seismometers, you get a sense of what I'm talking about. The paper is attached to the ground. Now, really, you need to anchor it to bedrock, but the paper is attached to the ground, and the pen is just suspended hanging above it. So the paper is actually moving underneath it. Pretty cool. And these are some of the waves that it traces out over time. And you learn how to tell when it's the P waves and when it's the S waves. So when we talk magnitude scales, each magnitude is 10 times greater than the previous one. So consider a magnitude 4. That's a pretty bad earthquake. How much worse is a magnitude 5? 10 times worse. How about a magnitude 6 compared to a magnitude 4? So that's a question. Is it 20 times worse? Is it 10 plus 10? Or is it 100 times worse? 10 times 10. It's 100 times worse. And when you think about that, that gets crazy because we have magnitude 9 earthquakes on this planet. And magnitude 4 earthquakes are pretty bad. I mean, not pretty bad like buildings fall, but you definitely are feeling them. Magnitude 9. How much worse is that, right? 5 would be 10 times worse. 6 would be 100 times worse. 7 would be 1,000 times worse. 8 would be 10,000 times worse. 9 would be 100,000 times worse. Okay, yeah, that gets bad. There is that other intensity scale. And this is the Mercalli scale. And it's just based on damage to structures and what witnesses said. If plates are shaking a little bit, if that's what they say, well, that's one intensity. If cars are rocking, okay, a different intensity. If chimneys collapse, what happened in an earthquake? And you can get a sense through the Mercalli scale of how bad the earthquake was. So 1 to 2, you are not likely to even feel it. 5 to 6, all right, it's getting serious. 7 to 8, it's really serious. And 9 to 10 is terrifying. So here's the idea of a Mercalli scale, right? The detected by instruments only, right? Number 2 would be, okay, sensitive people, if you're in a location where you could really feel it, you feel a little bit. 3, okay, vibration like a passing truck. Notice the city in the distance, completely unaffected. Notice the monuments, they're all fine. Cars fine. But it feels like a truck just passed. I remember feeling that myself one time in an earthquake I was in. The only earthquake I think I ever felt. It was so mild, I thought it was a truck passing outside. Now, this is feeling now by intensity 4, it feels like a truck was passing outside and then hit the building. So this is far more serious. Things are rattling inside. You could definitely feel it. Still, nothing's broken. Okay, by intensity 5, now things are starting to break. Um, uh, Mild, gentle stuff, glass breaks. A few things inside get pushed off shelves and things. They'll fall and break. It's not the end of the world, but it's getting serious. Now look at this. By intensity 6, now the chimney has fallen off. That can be the end of the world if you happen to be under it. Things are really moving inside hard. It's pretty scary. By 7, you want to get out of that house. Nobody wants to be in there. This is getting like really scary. The house is starting to break. Notice the city, the well-built city behind, no problem. Cars, though, are bouncing around. By 8, notice the well-built city, not so well-built anymore. Now they're having trouble. The building, a smaller building, not really well designed, may be in verge of collapsing. Monuments are toppling. Cars are flipping. By 9, this is devastation. This is so much destruction. Um, you have visible cracks in the ground. You have city buildings collapsing. You collapse of people's houses. Infrastructure is horribly damaged. This is one that is really, truly hard to deal with. Finally, by the time you get to 10, uh, very few buildings have survived this. You are not easily going to get up and running after this at all. This is devastated a community. How do you even get help to anybody here? Really, you can't use roads. Airports locally are broken. You would have to get them repaired. Helicopters, but how much stuff can a helicopter carry, and how many people are there in desperate need? If you ran out of your house and your house collapsed, you have what you were able to just grab and leave your house with. Um, that might not be very much. So, fortunately for us, we don't really have terrible earthquakes. A lot of people on the planet rarely experience any sizable earthquakes. Um, Most of the places where earthquakes occur are very localized regions where they know earthquakes occur. Over time, we've started building better, so our buildings can survive earthquakes better. But uh, the biggest one of these surrounds the Pacific Ocean. It's called the Ring of Fire. The Pacific Ocean is the old ocean. So as the plate comes out at the mid-ocean ridge, which is the Pacific, is actually called the East Pacific Rise because it's kind of been displaced. The um, seafloor moves for a very long distance until finally it's so old it breaks off and starts subducting, sometimes before it even reaches the edge of the Pacific. That's why you have so many of these island arc systems in the Pacific Ocean. By the time the plate gets to be about 220 million years old, it's old, cold, and dense. And it's so dense it breaks and starts subducting. So all these volcanoes come up. The Aleutian Islands, Japan, the Philippines, these are all created through the subduction around the Pacific Ocean, known as the Ring of Fire. Pretty cool. But those places exist simply because of this subduction happening. Um, but it means they're going to experience devastating volcanoes and devastating earthquakes. So it's an interesting area, pretty scary. So we have to learn how to find the distance to the quake. The P and S waves travel at different velocities. At any distance from the epicenter, the P and S waves have a unique time between them. All that's needed is to find the time interval between the P and the S waves and determine from the chart how far away the epicenter is to have that unique time, right? If you and a friend, and your friend is really fast and you're really slow, you both start a race. Go! 1 second if you both stop. Okay, she's a little bit ahead of you. Whatever. 5 seconds. Now she's quite a bit ahead of you. 10 seconds. Well, now she's way ahead of you. The distance will continue to grow between you so that at any moment in the race, you have a unique distance between you. Well, that's the same thing with the S and the P waves. P waves come out first, the S waves follow. And the P waves are faster, so they're always increasing the distance between the S and the P waves. So this is a simple chart. It shows the S and the P waves. It shows the P waves. Well, are they faster than the S waves? Look at how long it takes how about a P wave to travel 5. 5 what? Well, notice this is 10 to the third kilometers. That means 5,000 kilometers. How long does it take a P wave to travel that distance? Well, it looks to be right along here. All right. And so I guess we have to figure out if that's 1 minute, how much is each one of these boxes worth? Right? Think about that. How much is each one of those boxes worth? If that is 1 minute, well, there's 3 boxes. So each one must be worth 20 seconds. So this time that P wave took to travel 5,000 kilometers must be 8 minutes and 20 seconds. Beautiful. How long does it take an S wave to travel the same distance? Well, Well, look at that. It takes an S wave exactly 15 minutes to travel that same distance. So I would say the P wave is a lot faster in this diagram. 8 minutes and 20 seconds. And then at 8 minutes and 20 seconds after the earthquake occurred, the P wave got it. 15 minutes after the earthquake occurred, the S wave got to them. Okay, so notice there is a specific time difference between them. By the way, what is that time difference? Well, between 15 and 9 is 6 minutes. Between 9 and 8:20 is 40 seconds. So how about 6 minutes and 40 seconds? So if you have a P wave show up and then an S wave show up 6 minutes and 40 seconds later, you must be exactly 5,000 kilometers away from that earthquake. This is how you do it. So remember, this chart gives the actual time that the P and S wave take to travel a distance. So here's another example. It takes a P wave 4 minutes to travel 2,000 kilometers. Okay. It takes an S wave 7 minutes and 20 seconds to travel 2,000 kilometers. Therefore, at 2,000 kilometers from the epicenter, the S and the P waves arrive 3 minutes and 20 seconds apart. Hey, this makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Those are exactly 3 minutes and 20 seconds apart from each other. So this is how you do it. You take a piece of scrap paper, and let me tell you something. If you're not using scrap paper, this is not going to work out for you. Please, you got to use scrap paper. I have a lot of students who they can't do this, wondering why they can't do this, why they always get this wrong. Say, show me how you do it. They don't take out a piece of scrap paper. So, listen, why don't you take out a piece of scrap paper? Perhaps right now. I'll wait. You got your scrap paper yet? Great. So with your scrap paper, for this problem, you're going to measure out 4 minutes. All right? You're determining the time interval between the S and the P waves. So you determined that. It's 4 minutes. So you hold the scrap paper up to the graph, and you use it to find the place where the S and P waves are 4 minutes apart. You read straight down, and you find the distance to the epicenter. And notice this distance. If this is 2,000 kilometers here, and that's 3,000 kilometers there, and there's 5 boxes in between, what does each box have to be worth? 200 kilometers. So there's 3 boxes, so it must be 2,600 kilometers away. So if you want to find out where the earthquake actually occurred, well, think about it. A seismograph station will be able to determine the distance to an earthquake, but that's it, just how far the earthquake was. So all they can do is draw a circle around them and say the earthquake had to have occurred somewhere along that circle. So you're going to need 3 circles to figure out the exact location. Like that. If you had 2 circles, well, you've narrowed it down to 2 places where the 2 circles overlap. But if you want to narrow it down to a single spot, you will need 3 circles. So here's how you do it. If you look at this, so station Teague, when you look at it, there's 1 minute and 1.5 minutes between their P and S wave arrivals. So that means it's 900 kilometers. You get that from looking at the chart. SoCo, well, that's 3 minutes apart. So that means from them, it's 1,800 kilometers away. And SSPA, well, it's 5 minutes apart. So for them, they're at 3,300 kilometers away from that earthquake. When we put the data together on a map, you can see we would put our compass center right at that station, and we would draw a circle around the compass using the compass with you'll have a key down here for kilometers, and so you set your compass to 3,300 kilometers, and you draw that circle right around SSPA. Teague would have 900 kilometers, so you'd set your compass to 900 kilometers, draw your circle around station Teague, And similarly with SOCO, you would draw your circle around SOCO after setting your compass for 1,800 kilometers. And you'd see where they all meet. And you can see they all meet right here. Very often when you do this, your compass won't hit exactly, but you make it the most centered point you can, and that's fine. So some tracings to just get you started, sort of. So if you look at this, this looks like the time would be 9:05, 6, 7. So the P wave arrived at 9:08. The S wave arrived at 9:15. What's the time difference between 9:08 and 9:15? Just subtract, and you get 7 minutes. How about this one? Going from 9:03 to 9. Well, what would this time be right here? Well, clearly we have to estimate seconds. So it looks to be about a quarter of the way. I'd say maybe that. So that would be about 15 seconds. So this would be 9:06, because 1 minute after 9:05, 9:06, 15, maybe 20, but whatever. We could be close and it's still fine. So that would be 3 minutes and 15 seconds between those arrivals. How about this one? 11:01 to 11:05. What's the time difference there? That's 4 minutes. Excellent. Are P waves always going to arrive first? Well, aren't they faster? Yes, they are. So P waves will always arrive first. When we think of damage from earthquakes, the shaking will damage buildings. When the crust moves, it'll damage roads, railroads. Tsunamis probably are the worst of the damage. The earthquakes in oceans can cause waves which do devastating damage to coastal areas, and those very often are the greatest cost in lives. We have in the Hawaiian Islands, we have a tsunami station that can, a prediction center that can predict tsunamis, and we can send warnings out through the entire Pacific Basin. These are how many hours it takes for a tsunami to go from one place to another. So if you have a tsunami heading out from the Valdez Islands or Valdez, Alaska, it'll take this many hours. It'll take 11 hours to get all the way over here. So even though they're moving fast, the Pacific Basin is simply huge. Unfortunately, these tsunamis can be incredibly high. 30 meters, a meter is 3 feet. So you're pushing like 90 feet high. It's a hard thing to imagine. They travel at 500 miles an hour. They are incredibly devastating. Very often the first thing that happens is that the water goes out because you get the trough part of the wave first. So very often the water goes out and then it comes in with a vengeance. So if you could get warning, you get to higher ground. Absolutely, you must get to higher ground. And when you have a tsunami, it's not just one wave. It's a series of wave after wave. And very often the waves get worse. Each one gets worse. So look at that. What's the matter with that picture? Farmer looked like he did something weird right in the middle here. And you can see this is offset. That's actually a fault. This land here is moving this way. This land here is moving that way, right through an orange grove. And this is San Andreas Fault cutting right through the stream bed. You can see the stream bed is offset from the rest of the stream bed, right? This land here is moving that way. This land here is moving that way. Same idea. Well, nobody's going to be using a train on those tracks for a while. When we have this kind of damage, we need a fair bit of infrastructure repair before we could get supplies, much needed supplies, into the poor people who were living there. Um, when you have a bad earthquake, you often have broken gas lines underneath the roads in the city. You have gas pipes with flammable gas. That's what everybody's using for energy, for heat energy anyway. And very often that'll ignite. You also have broken water mains, so it makes it very hard to fight these terrible fires. Falling debris can be lethal. So one of the things we do in areas that are riskier, we have building codes that help keep structures from falling apart during earthquakes. Volcanoes. We have to talk about volcanoes a little bit. When a volcano explodes, the ash very often is a real problem. Airplanes cannot fly through volcanic ash, and the ash cloud can be huge and may linger for a very long time because the volcano can keep erupting for a long time. So occasionally it disrupts air travel. It will not cause crashes of airplanes. What it will do is coat the inner surfaces of the engine, which means they have to be removed and heavily serviced. It's very expensive, and you cannot run the engine until it is serviced from that. So always a problem, and any internal combustion engine will have tremendous damage. It's also bad to breathe the ash. Lava is unstoppable. It's very hard to do anything that can change the flow of a lava path. The worst thing is the Kefir cloud. Is if you're very close to the volcano, this hot cloud of ash coming down can be 1,000 degrees and very, very toxic. So that's the stuff that's bad about volcanoes. It's a small aspect of it, but important if you live next to a volcano. But earthquakes are the serious stuff. Well, I hope you learned something here, and thank you very much for your patience.